In the Grand Salon of Palacio de Torre Tagle, one of the most magnificent colonial mansions in all of Spanish America, the Marquise Doña Beatriz de Mendoza y Salazar received a letter that would shatter not just her family, but the entire social order of colonial Peru. The letter came from her personal physician, Dr. Hernando Villalobos, and it contained medical confirmation of something that had been whispered about in Lima's elite circles for months, but that everyone had been too terrified to speak aloud. The Marquise herself, age 42, was 4 months pregnant. Her eldest daughter, Catalina, age 23, was 6 months pregnant. Her middle daughter, Isabel, age 20, was 3 months pregnant. And her youngest daughter, Rosa, age 17, was 2 months pregnant. All 4 pregnancies had occurred while the Marquise's husband, the Marquis Don Fernando de Mendoza, was away in Spain for over a year on royal business, and the physician's examination had revealed something even more devastating. All 4 women showed physical evidence suggesting the same father, and that father was almost certainly not a Spanish nobleman. The skin tone of the developing fetuses, visible through the Marquise's translucent belly during examination, suggested significant African ancestry. There was only one man in the household who fit that description, who had access to all 4 women, who possessed the physical attributes and opportunity. His name was Tomás, a 28-year-old enslaved mulatto who served as the family's major-domo, the head of household staff who managed the mansion in the Marquis's absence. What had happened in that palace over the course of 1802 would, when fully exposed, trigger the greatest scandal in Lima's colonial history, force the Spanish Inquisition to investigate, result in multiple deaths, and ultimately contribute to the weakening of Spanish authority in Peru that would lead to independence movements within a decade. Lima in 1803 was the jewel of Spain's South American empire, the city of kings, capital of the Viceroyalty of Peru that controlled vast territories from Panama to Chile. The city's population was approximately 60,000, making it one of the largest cities in the Americas, but the demographics revealed the same terrifying reality that haunted all Spanish colonies. Pure-blooded Spaniards numbered fewer than 8,000. The rest were mestizos, mulattoes, indigenous people, enslaved Africans, and dozens of mixed-race categories that Spanish society obsessively catalogued. The Spanish lived in constant fear of losing control to the masses they ruled, so they maintained power through brutal violence and fanatical enforcement of racial and social boundaries. The casta system was even more rigid in Lima than elsewhere because Peru's wealth from silver mines made it the economic heart of the empire. Peninsulares born in Spain occupied the highest positions. Criollos born in the Americas of Spanish parents came next. Then came an elaborate hierarchy of mixed-race categories, each with specific legal rights and restrictions. At the bottom were enslaved Africans and indigenous people, whose labor generated the wealth that made Lima's elite among the richest people in the world. Sexual relationships across racial lines were simultaneously common and absolutely forbidden. Spanish men routinely raped enslaved women and indigenous servants, producing mixed-race children who complicated the casta system but rarely threatened Spanish men's social positions because children followed their mother's status. But sexual relationships between women of Spanish descent and men of African or indigenous ancestry were treated as existential threats to colonial order. Spanish women were supposed to embody purity and serve as biological vessels for producing pure-blooded Spanish children. If they chose or were forced into relationships with non-Spanish men, especially enslaved men, it threatened the entire racial hierarchy that justified Spanish rule. Such relationships were not just scandalous, they were heretical, potentially involving witchcraft or demonic influence, which is why the Inquisition took jurisdiction over cases where Spanish women were suspected of sexual contact with men of color. Don Fernando de Mendoza y Salazar represented the pinnacle of Lima's aristocracy. Born in 1758 into one of Peru's wealthiest families, he held the hereditary title of Marquise, controlled silver mining operations employing thousands of indigenous workers in brutal conditions, owned a mansion in Lima and estates throughout Peru, and commanded a fortune estimated at over 800,000 pesos. He had married Doña Beatriz de la Torre in 1779 when she was 18 and he was 21, a strategic union combining two powerful families. By 1803, they had produced 3 daughters and maintained one of Lima's most prestigious households. Don Fernando was frequently away on business, spending months or years in Spain managing political relationships and commercial interests, leaving Beatriz to manage their Lima household with its 40 enslaved workers and servants. Doña Beatriz de Mendoza y Salazar, born in 1761, was 42 years old in 1803 and represented everything Spanish colonial society valued in upper-class women. She was devoutly Catholic, attending Mass daily at the cathedral. She managed a household employing dozens of people with efficiency and strictness. She had raised 3 daughters in proper Spanish aristocratic fashion. She was active in charitable societies serving poor Spanish families. Her reputation was absolutely beyond reproach, which is why what happened was so incomprehensible to Lima society that many initially refused to believe it could be true. The 3 daughters had been raised in seclusion typical of upper-class Spanish girls in colonial Peru. Catalina, the eldest at 23, was engaged to be married to a Spanish military officer with the wedding planned for early 1804. Isabel, 20, was being courted by several Spanish noblemen. Rosa, the youngest at 17, was still receiving the education preparing her for eventual marriage. All 3 were kept under strict supervision, rarely leaving the house except for church and heavily chaperoned social events. They lived in a gilded cage, their every movement controlled, their marriage prospects determining their families' future alliances. The idea that all 3 could have become pregnant simultaneously was bizarre enough. That they were pregnant by the same man, and that man was an enslaved mulatto, was unthinkable. Tomás had been born in Lima in 1775, the son of an enslaved African woman and a Spanish merchant who never acknowledged paternity. His mother named him after St. Thomas, hoping the Christian name would provide some protection in a society that saw mixed-race people as inherently tainted. Tomás was a mulatto, someone of mixed African and European ancestry, which placed him in a complicated position in Lima's casta system. He was enslaved, legally property owned by the Mendoza family, but his literacy, education, and light-skinned appearance gave him privileges that darker-skinned enslaved Africans never received. Don Fernando had purchased Tomás in 1795, specifically because he needed an educated enslaved person to manage household affairs. During his frequent absences over 8 years, Tomás had proven invaluable, managing finances, supervising other servants, handling correspondence, essentially running the Mendoza household while Don Fernando traveled. This position gave Tomás unprecedented access to the Marquise and her daughters. He entered private family spaces routinely. He had legitimate reasons to speak with the women about household matters. He was trusted in ways that field slaves or common servants never were. But this trust and access existed within a framework of absolute power imbalance. Tomás was property, everything he did was at his owner's command or permission. If the Marquise or her daughters ordered him to do something, anything, he legally had no right to refuse. This power dynamic would become crucial in understanding what happened during 1802 and how different people would interpret the events. What actually occurred in the Palacio de Mendoza during 1802 would be disputed from the moment of exposure, through the trials and investigations that followed. The story had multiple contradictory versions depending on who was telling it, and each version revealed different assumptions about power, race, gender, and slavery. According to the version that Tomás would eventually testify to under torture by the Inquisition, the situation began in March 1802. 3 months after Don Fernando had departed for Spain, the Marquise had summoned Tomás to her private chambers late one evening, claiming she needed to discuss household accounts. But once Tomás arrived, Beatriz had locked the door and made clear she had different intentions. According to Tomás, the Marquise initiated sexual contact. and he, as an enslaved man, was powerless to refuse his owner's wife without risking severe punishment or death. Tomás claimed this was rape, that he was being sexually exploited by someone who held absolute power over his life. Over the following months, according to Tomás's testimony, the sexual relationship with Beatriz continued regularly. Then, in June 1802, Catalina, the eldest daughter, began summoning Tomás to her chambers as well, again under pretense of household business but with the same actual intentions. By August, Isabel had done the same. By October, even 17-year-old Rosa had initiated sexual contact with Tomás. According to his testimony, all 4 women were using their power over him to satisfy desires that Spanish society insisted proper women didn't have, and he was trapped because refusing any of them would mean punishment, because speaking about it to anyone would result in his execution for daring to accuse his owners, because the power imbalance made consent impossible. But the version that the Mendoza family and their allies would eventually put forth told a completely different story. In their account, Tomás was a manipulator who had used witchcraft or demonic powers to seduce all 4 women, to corrupt their natural Spanish purity, to bewitch them into behavior they never would have chosen freely. They would claim he had used African folk magic learned from his mother, that he had fed them potions or performed rituals that destroyed their free will. They would portray Tomás as predator and the 4 women as victims, which allowed them to maintain that Spanish women's purity was natural rather than socially constructed, that any sexual contact with enslaved men must involve coercion or supernatural influence rather than choice or mutual exploitation. The truth, as suggested by the fragmented historical evidence that survives, was probably more complicated than either version acknowledged. The relationship likely began with Beatriz exploiting her power over Tomás, a lonely woman whose husband was absent for extended periods, using an enslaved man she had complete control over to satisfy needs she couldn't acknowledge publicly. But over time, some genuine emotional connection may have developed despite the power imbalance. The daughter's involvement suggests either that they observed their mother's behavior and initiated similar exploitation, or that Beatriz, in a moment of shocking maternal transgression, actively facilitated her daughter's access to Tomás. The simultaneous pregnancies of all 4 women by the same man suggests either extraordinary carelessness or a situation so chaotic and psychologically twisted that normal precautions were abandoned. What is certain is that by late 1802, all 4 women were pregnant, and they had managed to hide it through clever dressmaking and isolation. Spanish upper-class women spent most of their time in private family spaces anyway, so their increasing seclusion didn't immediately raise suspicions. But by December 1802, when Don Fernando sent word that he would return to Lima in March 1803, panic set in. The Marquise and her daughters realized they would soon be unable to hide their conditions, and that Don Fernando's return would expose everything. In desperation, Beatriz consulted Dr. Villalobos in January 1803, claiming she needed medical advice for unnamed female health issues. But the doctor's examination revealed the pregnancies and their advanced stages. And Villalobos, as a licensed physician and faithful servant of Spanish colonial order, felt obligated to document his findings and report them to appropriate authorities. The scandal exploded across Lima society in late January 1803, when rumors began circulating that the Marquise and her daughters were all pregnant by the same enslaved man. At first, most of Lima's elite simply refused to believe it. The idea was too absurd, too contradictory to everything they believed about Spanish women's nature and about enslaved men's place in society. But, as evidence mounted, as more people confirmed they had noticed the pregnancies, as the Mendoza household descended into chaos, with servants being interrogated and the Marquise confined to her chambers, the undeniable truth became clear. The most prestigious family in Lima had been involved in exactly the kind of racial transgression that Spanish society most feared. The response from colonial authorities was immediate and overwhelming. the Archbishop of Lima ordered an investigation. The Viceroy dispatched officials to the Mendoza palace, and most ominously, the Holy Office of the Inquisition, which had operated in Lima since 1570 to root out heresy and enforce Catholic orthodoxy, took jurisdiction over the case because sexual contact between Spanish women and men of African ancestry was considered potential evidence of witchcraft or demonic influence. On February 3, 1803, Inquisition officials arrested Tomás and transported him to their headquarters, the Casa de la Inquisición, where he would be interrogated and tortured to reveal the full truth of what had happened and whether supernatural forces had been involved. The Inquisition's involvement escalated everything because their procedures were designed to extract confessions through psychological torture and physical pain. Tomás was placed in solitary confinement, questioned repeatedly about his relationships with the four women, and subjected to torture when his answers didn't satisfy interrogators. The Inquisition used techniques refined over centuries: the rack that dislocated joints, water torture simulating drowning, strappado that suspended victims by arms tied behind their backs. They wanted him to confess to using witchcraft, to reveal what African magic he had employed to corrupt four pure Spanish women. Tomás, enduring agony designed to break anyone, eventually confessed to everything they wanted to hear, admitting he had used folk remedies his mother taught him, claiming he had performed rituals to make the women desire him, saying whatever would make the torture stop, even though it meant confirming his own execution. Meanwhile, the Marquise and her 3 daughters were confined to the palace under house arrest while church authorities conducted their own investigation. They were questioned separately and together, interrogated about their relationships with Tomás, examined by physicians and midwives to confirm the pregnancies and attempt to determine paternity. The interrogations revealed contradictory accounts. Beatriz initially claimed Tomás had bewitched her, that she had acted against her will under supernatural influence. But under intensive questioning, she admitted she had initiated the first contact, though she maintained it had been a moment of temporary insanity that Tomás then exploited. The daughters told similar stories, each claiming initial resistance that was overcome through Tomás's manipulation or witchcraft, none able to fully explain how all 3 had ended up in sexual relationships with the same enslaved man simultaneously. Don Fernando received word of the scandal in Spain in early March 1803, and his response was immediate and furious. He departed for Lima immediately, but wouldn't arrive until May due to the months-long ocean voyage. In letters he sent ahead, he demanded that Tomás be executed immediately, that the pregnancies be terminated, and that his wife and daughters be confined to a convent for the rest of their lives. He expressed no concern for their well-being or any curiosity about how this situation had developed, only rage that his honor and family name had been destroyed by their behavior and by the enslaved man he had trusted to manage his household. On March 15, 1803, the Inquisition pronounced its verdict on Tomás. He was found guilty of witchcraft, of using demonic powers to corrupt Spanish women, and of the crime of sexual contact with his social superiors. The sentence was death by burning at the stake in an auto da fe, the public ceremony where the Inquisition executed heretics and witches to demonstrate the power of Catholic orthodoxy and Spanish authority. But before the execution could be carried out, something happened that would complicate the narrative colonial authorities had constructed. On March 18th, 3 days after his sentencing, Tomás managed to write a letter from his cell, smuggling it out through a guard who was moved by his suffering. The letter was addressed to the Viceroy and to the public of Lima, and in it, Tomás presented his version of events. He wrote that he had never used witchcraft, that he didn't even know how such things would work, that he had simply been an enslaved man used by 4 women who had the power to command him to do anything they wanted. He wrote that he had loved Beatriz, that despite the power imbalance, and despite knowing it was suicidal, he had developed genuine feelings for her and had hoped somehow they might eventually be together. He wrote that the daughter's involvement had not been his choice, that he had been terrified when each began summoning him because it meant exposure became more likely. He wrote that he was being executed not for witchcraft but for the crime of being involved with Spanish women while being an enslaved man of African descent, and that if he had been Spanish, the same acts would have been treated as adultery rather than heresy. He wrote that the system was designed so that when Spanish women and enslaved men had sexual contact, regardless of who initiated or what the actual dynamics were, the enslaved man would always be blamed and always be punished with death, while the women would be portrayed as victims, even if they had been the ones in power. The letter was copied and circulated throughout Lima before authorities could suppress it, and it caused enormous controversy. Many in Lima's Spanish elite dismissed it as lies from a condemned man trying to slander his betters, but others, including some clergy and intellectuals who had grown uncomfortable with slavery's moral implications, saw in Tomás's letter a troubling glimpse of how the power dynamics of slavery created situations where enslaved people could be sexually exploited and then executed for their own exploitation. The letter wouldn't save Tomás, but it would plant seeds of doubt that would eventually contribute to questioning colonial slavery in Peru. On March 25, 1803, Tomás was executed in Lima's Plaza Mayor in an elaborate auto da fe attended by thousands of spectators forced to witness the Inquisition's power. He was led to the stake, tied to the post, and as was customary, offered one final chance to confess and receive forgiveness. According to multiple witnesses, Tomás spoke clearly, saying, "I confess that I loved Doña Beatriz, and that love was my only crime. If the same God who commands love also commands racial hierarchies, then that God is a tyrant." This final blasphemy ensured that his execution was carried out immediately. The pyre was lit, and Tomás died in the flames while priests chanted prayers for his soul, and thousands watched in forced silence. His ashes were scattered in the Rimac River to ensure no relics could be recovered. His name was officially erased from all church records, and speaking his name became unofficially forbidden in polite Lima society. But Tomás's execution didn't resolve the scandal. It only addressed the most threatening aspect. The 4 pregnant women remained, their conditions advancing, their futures uncertain. The church's investigation concluded in April 1803 with findings that tried to satisfy competing needs. The women were declared victims of witchcraft, who bore no moral responsibility for becoming pregnant, which preserved the fiction that Spanish women were naturally pure and could only be corrupted through supernatural means. But they were also declared to have shown weakness in succumbing to temptation, which required lifelong penance to cleanse their souls. The recommended sentence was permanent confinement in separate convents for the mother and each daughter, where they would live as penitents for the rest of their lives. Don Fernando arrived in Lima in May 1803, and his rage had not diminished during the voyage. He filed for annulment of his marriage on grounds of his wife's adultery and bewitchment, a petition the church approved within weeks. He disowned all 3 daughters, removing them from his will and stripping them of the Mendoza name and any inheritance rights. And he demanded that the pregnancies be terminated immediately, arguing that allowing the children to be born would perpetuate the scandal and create mixed-race bastards with potential claims on the Mendoza estate. This demand created a theological and legal crisis because the Catholic Church generally opposed abortion, but Spanish colonial law treated mixed-race children as inherently inferior and potentially threatening to social order. After intensive debate, a compromise was reached that reflected the cruelty and cynicism of the system. The 4 women would be allowed to carry their pregnancies to term, but the moment the children were born, they would be taken away and sold immediately to slave traders who would transport them to other viceroyalties where their origins wouldn't be known. The women would never know what happened to their children, and the children would never know their maternal heritage. It was a solution that technically avoided the sin of abortion while achieving the same goal, eliminating the evidence of racial transgression. Between August and October 1803, all 4 women gave birth in separate locations under heavy guard and secrecy. Beatriz delivered a boy in August. Catalina delivered a girl in September. Isabel delivered twins, a boy and girl, in late September. Rosa delivered a boy in October. All 6 children showed mixed African and European features, confirming what everyone had known about their paternity. True to the agreement, each child was taken from its mother within hours of birth. The women were allowed no time to bond, no chance to nurse or hold their children. The infants were handed to slave traders who transported them to different regions of Spanish America, scattering them so thoroughly that they could never be traced. The official records listed them only as mulatto bastards of unknown parentage, erasing both Tomás and the Mendoza women from their histories. The 4 women were then transferred to their permanent confinements. Beatriz was sent to the convent of Santa Catalina in Arequipa, 600 miles from Lima, a cloistered institution where she would spend the rest of her life as a penitent, never allowed to leave, never permitted contact with the outside world except through heavily censored letters. Catalina was sent to a convent in Trujillo, 350 miles north of Lima. Isabel to a convent in Cusco. Rosa, the youngest, to a convent in Quito in modern Ecuador, over 1,000 miles from Lima. The separation was deliberate, ensuring they could never communicate with each other, never share their experiences, never develop a united narrative about what had happened. Each woman was condemned to spend decades in isolated penance, their lives as effectively ended as Tomás's, just without the mercy of quick death. Don Fernando, his honor somewhat restored through decisive action against his family, remarried within a year to a Spanish noblewoman from a rival family, and had 2 more daughters with her. He never spoke of his first wife or 3 daughters again, referring to them only obliquely as the women who brought shame to my house. He died in 1821, just as Peru's independence movement was reaching its climax, never seeing the collapse of the colonial system his family had helped build. The scandal had lasting effects far beyond the Mendoza family. In the short term, it triggered a moral panic in Lima about controlling women more strictly and monitoring enslaved men more carefully. New regulations were passed restricting enslaved men from positions, giving them unsupervised access to Spanish women. Families increased surveillance of their daughters and wives. The paranoia intensified racial boundaries at exactly the moment when Peru's demographics and economic changes were making those boundaries harder to maintain. But the scandal also had unintended consequences that worked against colonial authority. Tomás's letter and his final statement had been heard by thousands. His claim that the system was designed to always blame enslaved men, regardless of actual power dynamics, resonated with the enslaved and mixed-race populations that formed the majority of Lima's people. The hypocrisy of executing Tomás for witchcraft while Spanish men routinely raped enslaved women without consequences became a talking point for critics of colonial slavery. When independence movements began gaining strength in Peru in the 1810s, revolutionary propaganda explicitly cited cases like the Mendoza scandal as evidence that Spanish colonial rule was morally bankrupt, that a system requiring such elaborate fictions about racial purity and such brutal violence to maintain itself was inherently illegitimate. The scandal became part of the intellectual ammunition that independence leaders used to argue that Peru needed to break from Spain and create a new society not based on racial hierarchies enforced through violence. Peru achieved independence in 1821, and while the new republic certainly didn't create racial equality, the old casta system was formally abolished and the Inquisition was dissolved, ending the institutional framework that had made Tomás's execution possible. Beatriz de Mendoza died in the convent of Santa Catalina in 1829 at age 68, having spent 26 years in confined penance. She never spoke of the events of 1802 to 1803 in the letters that survive from her convent years, writing only about religious devotion and prayers for forgiveness. Whether she genuinely believed she needed forgiveness, or whether she had simply internalized the narrative that colonial authorities had imposed on her experience, the records don't reveal. Catalina died in 1832, at age 52 in her convent in Trujillo. Isabel survived until 1841, dying at 58 in Cusco. Rosa, the youngest, lived the longest, dying in 1847 at 61 after 44 years of convent life. None of the 4 women ever learned what happened to their children. The 6 infants sold into slavery in 1803 disappeared into the vastness of Spanish colonial slave systems. 2 may have died in childhood, which was common for enslaved children in harsh plantation conditions. The others survived into adulthood as enslaved workers on various estates, never knowing their maternal heritage, never understanding why they had been separated from their mothers at birth, living and dying as anonymous cogs in the machinery of colonial exploitation. The historical record contains no trace of any of them beyond the bare notations of their births and sales. The Palacio de Mendoza, the grand mansion where everything had happened, was sold by Don Fernando in 1804 to erase all associations with the scandal. It changed hands several times over the decades and eventually became the Palace of Torre Tagle, which today serves as the Peruvian Foreign Ministry. The building is one of the finest examples of colonial architecture in Lima. Its Baroque facade and elaborate balconies admired by tourists and diplomats. But there is no plaque, no memorial, no acknowledgement of the scandal that occurred within its walls in 1802 to 1803. The official tour guides discuss the architecture and the prominent families who lived there, but they skip from the 18th century to independence without mentioning the Mendoza scandal, which remains too uncomfortable to incorporate into the building's tourist-friendly history. The case of Tomás and the Mendoza women represents one of the most thoroughly documented examples of how racial and gender hierarchies intersected in colonial Latin America to create situations where power, exploitation, desire, and violence became impossible to untangle. It reveals that sexual relationships across racial lines happened constantly, despite prohibitions. That Spanish women could be sexual actors rather than passive objects, that enslaved men could be victimized by those who owned them, and that when such relationships were exposed, colonial authorities would construct whatever narrative was necessary to maintain the fiction that racial boundaries were natural rather than brutally enforced. Whether Tomás was a predator who used his position to manipulate 4 women, or a victim who was exploited by women with absolute power over him, or some complicated mixture of both, he was executed for the unforgivable crime of being involved with Spanish women while being an enslaved man of African descent. And the 4 women, whether they initiated the relationships or were manipulated into them, whether they acted from desire or were bewitched, spent the rest of their lives paying for the sin of proving that Spanish women were human beings capable of sexual desire across racial boundaries rather than the pure angelic figures colonial ideology required them to be. This is the scandal that Lima tried to forget, that was erased from official histories, that remained hidden in Inquisition archives and church records until modern historians recovered the fragmented documents. It's the story of 6 children who never knew their parents, of 1 man burned at the stake for loving or exploiting or being exploited by women who owned him, of 4 women who spent decades in convent cells for being human in ways their society forbade. And it's a window into the terrible machinery of colonial slavery, which corrupted every human relationship it touched and required constant violence to maintain the lies it was built upon.